Hello, lovely people. This first lesson is on introducing psychology. And we're going to go over a lot of little things in this first lesson that we will revisit throughout the course of the year. So this is kind of like your foundational introductory lesson. So before we really jump in, we got to define what psychology is. What is psychology? It's the scientific study of the behavior and mental processes of humans and other animals. So behaviors and mental processes. Why is psychology scientific? Well, it's scientific because it uses empiricism and the scientific method to critically evaluate evidence. And we'll go over what both of those things are. In just a couple of minutes. You already know the scientific method from science classes, but we'll review it in terms of the scientific method and how it's used in psychology in a later lesson. So what's behavior? Psychology examines behavior, which consists of any observable and measurable action taken by a person or other animal. In other words, it's anything a person or an animal does. Mental processes consists of the internal, subjective experiences inferred from behavior. So, sensations, perceptions, dreams, thoughts, beliefs, feelings. So, people have been wondering about the mind for years and years and years. And early philosophers wondered about the mind, how the mind works, how does our body relate to our mind, how much of what we know is innate, how much are we born with, and how much comes from our experiences. These were some of the really big questions that got philosophers really discussing and questioning about the mind. So we're going to go over a little history of philosophy, and we're going to chunk it up by different areas, different locations. So the Greeks, we have Socrates and Plato. They were mind and body are separate, and the mind continues after death. Knowledge is innate. On the other hand, Aristotle believed you needed data. Knowledge comes from observation. You're not just born with it, and it's not innate. The French, we have Descartes, agreed with Socrates and Plato. He dissected animals, and fluid in the brain flows through nerves to muscles, causing movement. He realized that through dissections in animals. The British, we've got Bacon and Locke. Bacon was the founder of modern science with empiricism. And John Locke is the mind at birth is a blank slate on which experience writes, so that you are born with a blank slate. Empiricism is the idea that knowledge is the result of experience, and that scientific knowledge is developed through observation and experimentation. What were important milestones in psychology's early development? So this lesson is going to really focus on who, the what, and the what kinds of psychologists do we have today based on the who and the what. Okay, so we're going to really kind of marry the who and the what throughout this lesson. So Wilhelm Wundt established the first psychology lab, wanted to measure the atoms of the mind, the fastest mental processes. He tested in 2 separate trials. Subjects were asked to press a telegraph key as soon as they heard the sound of a ball hitting a platform, and they were consciously aware of perceiving the sound. In the first trial, the subjects pressed the button in 1/10 of a second when they heard the sound of a ball hitting a platform, but it took 2/10 of a second to wait until they were consciously aware of perceiving the sound. So moving on from Wundt's experiments, we have Edward Titchener, who introduced structuralism to study the elements of the mind, and he used introspection. Structuralism is an early school focused on identifying the elements of thought and mind, the structures, the way that early chemists developed the periodic table to classify elements. Introspection is the process of looking inward to directly observe one's own psychological processes. Charles Darwin was our believer of natural selection and of mental and physical traits and adaptive evolution, and also he influenced William James. William James is the one who introduced functionalism and also wrote the Principles of Psychology. Functionalism assumes a purpose. So smelling and thinking must have helped us evolve. That was Charles Darwin, the whole evolution. So functionalism assumes a purpose. Smelling and thinking, for example, must have helped us evolve. Structures of consciousness must serve a function. So he's taking structuralism one step further and saying, what are the functions of these structures? So smelling is what the nose does, thinking is what the brain does, but why? So we're moving on. A student of William James, Mary Whiton Calkins, she was denied her PhD due to being a woman. She was a memory researcher and the first female president of the APA, the American Psychology Association. Another woman, Margaret Floy Washburn, she was a student of Edward Titchener and the first female to earn a PhD in psychology and wrote what's called The Animal Mind. So moving on from structuralism and functionalism, we're moving into behaviorism. Behaviorism, we've got two key figures, B.F. Skinner and John B. Watson, that we're going to discuss. But before we do, we got to discuss what behaviorism is. Psychology should be an objective science. Observable behavior is important to study, not the unseen mental processes. So that's what behaviorism is based on, is that you can observe behaviors. Sigmund Freud furthered the development of psychological science and he developed an influential treatment process called psychoanalysis, and his theory is the personality theory. His psychoanalytic psychology is all about unconscious forces and childhood experiences and how they affect our behavior and mental processes. Moving on from behaviorism into humanism. How did humanism further the development of psychological science? So Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers, they believe that humans strive to reach their full potential, are capable of unconditional love and personal growth. Humanism is a third force in psychology, rejected both behaviorism and psychoanalytic psychology, and the study of potential and personal growth with humans. Some other important figures and approaches. G. Stanley Hall, the first psych lab in America. Ivan Pavlov, classical conditioning, learning through association. Jean Piaget, cognitive development in kids. Again, we're going to go over who these important figures are with relation to their topic. So for example, when we get to classical conditioning and all the different experiments involved with classical conditioning, we'll be going back and reviewing what Pavlov's contribution was to that. So don't freak out. There's a lot of people, there's a lot of different approaches. This is just your introduction to it. We will be going deeper on each of these as we touch them throughout the year. Jean Piaget, he cognitive development in kids, so really studied how do kids cognitively develop. And then the Gestalt approach is an approach that means the whole of anything is greater than its parts, and it's a study of perception. And there's some really cool figures that go along with that. So we'll be looking at some of those when we get to like some illusion type things. So contemporary psychology, how does it focus on cognition, biology, and experience? So we got to first talk about nature versus nurture. So is it genes or is it experience? And contemporary psychology recognizes the importance of both nature and nurture as well as how they interact. What exactly is nature? Nature is behaviors and mental processes occur because they are inborn or innate, like you are born with them. Whereas nurture, behaviors and mental processes occur as a result of experience or the environment. So those are things that are learned over time. Whereas nature, you're born with. And put down the key figures that believed in nature and the key figures that believed in nurture. So Darwin, a little bit more on Darwin with nature and nurture. He argued for nature in his book on the origin of the species. And so those of you who are taking biology this year will be really going in detail with natural selection. And Darwin believed that traits and behaviors that provide a survival or reproductive advantage are naturally selected. Traits and behaviors are naturally selected, not people or animals, but traits and behaviors. It's really important to really know that difference. So there are a couple other things to talk about before we dive into more different types of approaches. We've got to talk about evolutionary psychology, which is the study of how behaviors and mental processes present in the species today exist because they were naturally selected. And then behavior genetics, the study of the relative influence and limits of genetic or nature and environmental nurture influences on behaviors and mental processes. So evolutionary is all about behaviors and mental processes because they were naturally selected, and behavior is the study of the relative influence and limits of nature nurture and the influences of nature and nurture on behaviors and mental processes. Some cool stuff. This isn't for you to write down in your notes, but some cool stuff related to that are the twin studies. So identical twins, which are monozygotic, and you'll learn more about this in biology as well, but mono means one. They share 100% of the same genes, whereas fraternal dizygotic twins share 50% of the same genes. Di meaning two. And twin studies provide evidence for the relative influence of nature and nurture and are used in behavior genetics. Culture is also really heavily important in contemporary psychology. The shared ideas, values, behaviors, and traditions shared by a group of people and passed from one generation to the next. Culture impacts perception of time and promptness, ideal personal space, beliefs about marriage and sex, emotional display, and many other things. These are some of the main things that we're going to talk about with culture and how it impacts people and psychology. So, how does culture where from impact kissing, for example? This is cool stuff. In cultures with languages that read from left to right, about 2/3 of the couples lean their heads to the right when kissing. So we read from left to right. And so what this is saying is that about 2/3 of Americans will tilt their head to the right when kissing. 77% of Hebrew and Arabic language speakers who read from right to left, which is the opposite of how we read, kiss by tilting their heads to the left. So that's pretty cool stuff. They read opposite of how they kiss. Gender, which socially constructed roles and characteristics by which a culture defines male and female, reported gender differences, how emotions are expressed or detected, what we dream, risk for certain psychological disorders, and then biological similarities of gender, age of the first steps, how we remember and forget, overall intelligence and well-being. Shared biological processes guide behavior across cultures. So individuals with specific learning disorders, formerly dyslexia, show the same brain malfunction across diverse cultures. So what that means is that the brain doesn't change in individuals regardless of the culture with specific learning disorders. All human languages share the same deep principles of grammar, and nonverbal communication of basic emotions is universal. Example, the message of a smile. Positive psychology is the study of human flourishing, the goal of discovering and promoting human strengths and virtues, strengthening individuals and communities. Pretty awesome. We're going to move into some more different types of approaches, and the next one is the biopsychosocial approach. Biopsychosocial. So we've got understanding behavior or mental processes from 3 key viewpoints. Biopsychosocial. Behavioral perspective is how learned and observable behaviors impact behavior and mental processes. Biological perspective is how biological, meaning genes, neurohormonal, and physiological processes impact behavior and mental processes. So this is all about how behavior and mental processes are affected or impacted. And with behavioral, it's how learned and observable behaviors impact it, whereas biological, it's how genes and neural and hormonal things impact behavior and mental processes. Cognitive perspective is how interpretations of situations and mental processes, thoughts, memories, problem solving, how those things impact our behavior and mental processes. Evolutionary perspective, we've already touched on how the natural selection of traits has promoted their survival of genes. We've also touched on the humanistic perspective, how the drive for personal growth and self-actualization impact behavior and mental processes. Psychodynamic perspective is how unconscious drives and conflicts impact behavior and mental processes. So the things that you're not conscious of. Social cultural perspective is how behavior and thinking vary across situations and cultures. So those are the main types of approaches. Now we're going to go into the types of psychologists that exist. And before we get into the types of psychologists that exist, we got to talk about the difference between basic and applied psychology. So in terms of research, basic research is scientific inquiry that aims to increase psychology's knowledge base. It's pure science. Whereas applied research is scientific inquiry that aims to use psychology to solve practical problems. So it's more of a real-world application of science. What types of psychologists conduct basic research? We've got a list here. You don't need to write this down, but I wanted to give you some examples. Biological psychologists, so neuroscientists, developmental, cognitive, educational, personality, and social, conduct the basic research. And the applied research, biological also, developmental, cognitive, educational, personality, social, industrial, organizational, human factors psychologists. So there's several overlapping psychologists in both of these columns. Psychologists, as a helping profession, guide people toward healthier relationships. They don't fix it for them, they guide them, help people overcome anxiety and depression, and help people cope with difficulties. Counseling and clinical psychologists differ in that counseling helps people cope with adjustments and crises, challenges related to work, school, family relationships, can administer and interpret psychological tests, provide therapy and counseling, and may conduct research. One of the differences in clinical psychologists is that they assess and treat mental, emotional, and behavioral disorders, and the other 3 bullet points are the same. Now, what's the difference between a clinical psychologist and a psychiatrist? A clinical psychologist holds a PhD or a doctorate in psychology, provides psychotherapy to individuals with psychological disorders, whereas a psychiatrist is an MD, may prescribe drugs to treat the physiological causes of psychological disorders. They also may provide psychotherapy. So psychologists cannot prescribe medicine, psychiatrists can. One important person who we want to talk about as is treating psychology as a reforming profession is Dorothea Dix. She was a reformer who advocated for the humane treatment of the mentally ill. She was so important with really advocating for mentally ill people who could not advocate for themselves. Okay, so we're going to zip through now the different types of psychologists, what they do, where do they work. So cognitive psychologists study human thinking and might work as a professor or corporate consultant. Developmental psychologists study how our behavior changes as we age, might work in a school, daycare center, and might specialize in elder behavior or a senior center. Educational psychologists study how we learn in different environments and in different ways, might also work in schools or universities designing tests or teacher trainings. Experimental psychologists conduct experiments to understand our behaviors and our mental processes, might work as professors at a university or be employed at a research institution, zoo, business, or government agency. Psychometric psychologists use math and statistics to create, administer, score, and interpret tests. Intelligence or personality tests are examples. They might work in a university or a private research firm or government agency. Social psychologists study how we interact with others and how groups impact us individually. They might work as university professors or in consulting positions, market research, or other applied fields such as social neuroscience. IO psychologists, industrial organizational psychologists is what that stands for, study the relationship between people and our work environment. So investigate worker productivity and personnel selection, as well as organizational structuring, consumer behavior and training, work as university or in business industry consulting or a government agency. Clinical psychologists promote psychological health in individuals, groups, or organizations, may specialize in specific psychiatric disorders. Can work in a private practice, mental health organizations, schools, industries, legal systems, counseling centers, correctional facilities, or the military. Counseling psychologists help individuals cope or make difficult life changes, might work as university professors or in a counseling center, community mental health center, school, business, or in private practice. Personality psychologists observe social situations and how they are influenced by individual emotion and conduct. They explain behavior in areas such as aggression, persuasion, attraction, conformity, and group interaction, may specialize in a niche such as a leadership, attitude, group behavior, and conflict resolution. Biological psychologists analyze how the brain, neurotransmitters, and other aspects of our biology influence our behaviors, thoughts, and feelings. And we're going to really be diving into that in Neuro 2, biological psychology and brain, neurotransmitters, all that good stuff. It's so exciting.